Hello, this is your first of two videos on the U.S. presidency. This one, part one, is mainly about the institution of the presidency, the rules and elections and so forth. And the second one is going to be more about the politics of the presidency. There's some overlap, but I've tried to separate it out as much as I could. First, when we think about the presidency, it's useful to think about the presidency as an institution that is there, that's been around since the Constitution was drafted, and then the president as an individual. So we have a whole lot of presidents. Each one passes through the office, they come and go, and the institution remains. Now, the institution of the presidency has changed, it has evolved, and they have become more powerful over time. But individual presidents can be more or less influential depending upon how they use the tools that are available to them. But one thing we can say is that presidents are actually less able to control decisions than most Americans think. Most of us have come to regard the president as having really probably more power than they really do. And they kind of like it that way. They kind of, when they run for office particularly, they make all sorts of promises about what they're going to do if they're elected. And many of those things really are things that they don't have the power to do. Because presidents like Congress and like the courts are constrained by the Constitution, by the laws, by the limits of their office. And it's, presidents actually would probably like to have more power. I think virtually all of them would if they could have more power than they actually have. Now, I'm not saying they don't have a lot of power, because the presidency is a very influential, very powerful office, but I'm just saying that there are limits to what they can do, and sometimes they get frustrated with those limits. So the presidency has both an institutional side, as I mentioned, the institution of the presidency, and a personal dimension, which is the interaction of a given president's personality with the tools of the office. And in the second video on the presidency, I'm going to talk a lot about that. In this one, I'm going to talk a lot about the institutional presidency, the institution itself, which has expanded a lot since the 1930s, and there's some of that in this video and also in the second one. But always understand that presidential power depends ultimately on the person who occupies the office. The personal dimension is very, very important because it's one person, one personality interacting with an office. Persuasion abilities, the ability to convince members of Congress and others to do what they want, the ability to influence the public, these are very important skills. And as we'll learn, job approval ratings become important as sort of an informal source of power. And for many people, presidents have a lot of emotional and personal, psychological significance. They help people feel secure, or insecure, as the case may be. And it's also important to understand that the presidency sits right at the center of our governmental and economic elites. In our system, although I think, clearly we do have people we call elites who are very powerful, the leaders in Congress and so forth, leaders of our economy, powerful, wealthy corporate executives and that sort of thing. Really, power doesn't work in our country through commanding as much as it does through seeking consensus and trying to persuade. And the president stands at the center of this. It's a very complex system of elites from the economy and the government. Presidents are uniquely positioned to try to get those elites on the same page and get them to do things, to move the country in a certain direction. Some presidents are good at it, some are not. They have a lot of roles that they play. Presidents are the leader of their political party. They are the head of the U.S. government. They are the head of state, meaning they represent the United States of America to the world in our interactions with other nations. And they are also a symbol of national unity, especially in times of crisis. So, in the world moving with economic and governmental elites, presidents propose policies. They try to get people on the same page or mobilize influence within the system to try to get things through Congress and the bureaucracy and the courts. They serve as the leader of their party, and they, as we'll learn, they manage from the very top the entire executive branch of the U.S. government, the whole bureaucracy. For ordinary people like us, the president, as I said, symbolizes national unity. and we often attach great emotional significance to the things the president says and does. And so, under Trump, some people, for example, found him a very important, charismatic leader, and other people hated him. With each president, whether it's Obama or Biden or Clinton or Bush, that sort of thing tends to happen. Some people attach very positive emotions to the president, and others very negative emotions. Another very important aspect of this is the relationship between Congress and the presidency. That is the key relationship in our constitutional system. And it's really important to understand this. The national government in the Constitution was set up as a system of legislative supremacy and distrust of executive power, which they associated with monarchs. And we've talked a bit about that. The original plan was Congress was going to run the country, and the president would execute the orders, so to speak, the laws passed by Congress. But it was also understood the president was going to run foreign policy, and that is still the case. But what happened was, from the founding through the 1930s, Congress was the main policy-making institution of this country, with very few exceptions, such as Lincoln during the Civil War. But since the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, which is the 1933 through 1944, the presidency has increasingly become the real leader of the U.S. government, and that is not the way the Constitution originally set it out. And a number of things happened to bring about that change. I'll probably say this several times, but one part of that is that the U.S. became a world power, starting with the Spanish-American War in 1898. Well, when that happened, the presidency became more powerful because presidents do run our foreign policy. That is the way the Constitution is set up. And so as we became more important in international affairs, the president became more important. And then, and I'm going to talk about this at length in the second video, Congress has delegated or granted a lot of their legislative power over domestic policy to the executive branch by creating this gigantic federal bureaucracy that is supervised by the president. So another thing that happened is that the rise of mass media made it more powerful for presidents to talk directly to the public, which they could never do before we had mass media. And so you add these things up, the rise of the U.S. as a world power, congressional delegation of authority to the president, to the executive branch, and the rise of mass media, and you see important new sources of power for the president that they didn't have when the Constitution was drafted. So let's get into talking about the institutional presidency. This is Mount Rushmore. You can see some of our presidents up there carved into stone. Briefly, just on the qualifications, in case you're planning on running for president, you have to be 35 years old, a natural-born U.S. citizen. That's an interesting thing. What exactly does that mean, natural-born? You have to be a U.S. resident for at least the previous 14 years. They are elected to 4-year terms. They are chosen ultimately by electors, selected from the states. The way we choose the president is quite a bizarre system. We call it the Electoral College, but basically, simply put, the popular vote in the states is used to choose a slate of electors who are pledged or committed to vote for a certain candidate. So when we know who won the popular vote, we actually know who's going to get those electors. There have been attempts made, to sway electors and to disrupt this whole process. As you know, on January 6th, 2021, former President Trump and a group of other people attempted to change the outcome of the election in that way. But that's because we have kind of a clunky old process here that has a lot of different steps in it at the state level and the congressional level. And I'm not going to really test you on all of that, but it is a clunky old world sort of process. The president cannot be elected more than twice. That is the 22nd Amendment. And if the president is convicted after being impeached, the Senate can vote to disqualify a president from ever holding federal office again. We've had several impeachments. Bill Clinton was impeached. Trump was impeached twice, but they weren't convicted in the Senate. So the impeachment is the accusation. It takes place in the House. The trial takes place in the Senate. And just like with any criminal trial, someone can be accused but found not guilty. And that is what happened in those cases. Now, just in case anyone's curious, Republicans made some ridiculous issue out of whether President Barack Obama was was a natural-born U.S. citizen or not. And of course he was. It was really a bad faith argument. Everybody knew it. But here's his birth certificate. He was born on August 4th, 1961 in Honolulu, Hawaii. And everyone knew that. And this was really never a good faith argument. But there was never any doubt about that fact. But there you have it. So in case anyone's wondering. Now this whole question about indirect election of the president, as I said, I'm not going to grill you on all the nuances of this because it is quite complicated. But it's right there in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. So every state is given a certain number of representatives in the House and 2 senators. So all the states have at least 3 electoral votes. Now, all the states have set it up so that the way the electors are chosen is through the popular vote. Theoretically, a state could change that, but that is the way it works. And interestingly, the Congress also has control over elections. So elections are very odd in that they're a combination of state law and federal law. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 4, Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes. And so you see, Congress has a role in this as well. The 12th Amendment in 1804 provided that the electors cast separate votes for president and vice president. Originally, they would cast 2 votes, and then whoever got the most votes came in first and was president, and whoever got the largest number of votes was vice president. And that doesn't work because you could have 2 people who hate each other as president and vice president. So now the electors cast 1 vote for president and 1 vote for vice president. But understand, the electors are committed. The states decide how to choose the electors choose the president, but the states have set it up, because of political parties have set it up, so that we as individuals, voters, vote for slates of electors who are identified as being pledged or committed to a party's candidate. So when we know who won the popular vote, we know who gets the electors. The electors, with some very rare exceptions, never or almost never do other than what they've pledged to. Now, how do we elect the president again? It takes 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. So, I've laid it out here in great detail. You can see all the provisions here. You have 1 elector for each House representative the state has. So a number of states only have 1. California has 55. So the lowest states would have 3 electors, and the highest, California, had 58 in the most recent election. So the District of Columbia gets 3 electors. And so this gives us a total number of electors of 538, because we have 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, and 3 electors for the District of Columbia, which they get pursuant to the 23rd Amendment. So half plus 1, so to speak, and a bare majority of 538 is 270. And so you need 270 electors to win the presidency. If no candidate gets that majority, then the House of Representatives picks the president. That's the 12th Amendment. And each state delegation gets 1 vote. This is a very odd way to do it. They don't just, you have all 435 people vote. Each state has to agree to cast 1 vote. So it's state by state by state in terms of the House. So whichever candidate can get a majority of the state delegations wins. That would mean whichever state party controls the most state delegations would pick the president if it goes to the House. Now here's I'm going to show you a couple of elections here. Here's the 2020 election. This is the most carefully reviewed election in American history. This is undoubtedly the most accurate counting of votes that any election has ever had. And as you know, the loser in that election, Trump, complained about it endlessly. And as a result, it was all the states that were close were scrutinized very, very closely in litigation by judges, and they were recounts over and over and over. This election result is the most accurate one we've ever had. Biden won with, as you can see, and the states that are in blue are the ones that were won by Biden, and the states that are in red were won by Trump. So you can see it's an interesting pattern, because the Republican states are basically contiguous. They're like a pattern. You have the western states, most of the southern states, except for Georgia, and the upper Midwest, or part of it. And then the Democrats have their strength in the Northeast, the real upper Midwest, and the Pacific states. It's an interesting pattern that you see has emerged since the 1960s. Now, the number of electoral votes is going to change for the 2024 election. Why? Because of the census results. Every 10 years, we reallocated, as you may recall, the members of the House of Representatives. Some states gain, some states lose. Like Illinois is going to lose a seat in the House of Representatives. Pennsylvania, New York, a number of these states will lose, and some will gain. Texas will gain a couple, Florida will gain one, etc. And so what this will mean, if we ran the 2020 election again with the what will soon become the allocations, it would be a slight difference of 3. Biden would have won by 3 fewer than he did. So these changes happen every 10 years because the number of representatives each state gets changes. Lastly, presidential succession. We have a very complicated, or not complicated, very comprehensive system for making sure that we always have a president. If the president is, it says in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6, if the president is removed from office, by impeachment, or dies, or resigns, or can't discharge his job, the vice president becomes the president. And then we also have a line of succession. So it goes from the vice president, and if that person can't handle it or can't do the job, Speaker of the House, then the President pro tem of the Senate, then the Secretary of State, and Treasury, and Defense, and Attorney General, and on down the list, you see. And so it would be almost impossible for us to be without a president. I mean, you'd have to take out the president and a whole array of other cabinet level, etc. officials. We also have a 25th Amendment. This is a newer one, 1967. It addressed a problem that was not taken care of in the Constitution. What do you do if the president is alive, is still in office, but can't carry out their duties temporarily? And they did this in part because we had issues with Presidents Eisenhower and particularly President Eisenhower, and it's happened with other presidents where they were temporarily unable to do their job because, let's say, they were anesthetized due to surgery or something like that. But you could imagine any number of things happening to a president that would keep them from carrying out their functions. So the president or the vice president and the cabinet can transfer temporarily the president's powers to the vice president. And then if the president contests that, there is a procedure for the president to contest it and get his or her power back. But that covers temporary disability. It also says what happens with the vice president. And what happens if the vice president leaves office? So if the vice presidency is vacant for some reason, then the president nominates a new vice president who is then has to be confirmed by both houses of Congress by majority vote. Now, what I want to talk with you about for the rest of this video is the types of power that presidents have. I kind of laid out the office and how they're selected, but let's talk about, because presidents have different kinds of power. Basically 4 types. One is what we call enumerated powers, or sometimes called express powers. Those are the ones that are described in the words of the Constitution. And executive power, the power to see that the laws are faithfully executed, etc. And pardoning, that sort of thing. They're right there in the document. Second is implied power. That is powers that the president has because they need them in order to carry out one or more of the enumerated powers. Third, something called inherent power. Now, this is a very controversial and interesting subject, which is a power that presidents claim to have to do whatever they think is necessary for the interests or security of the United States. Not in writing, not enumerated, not implied, just I have to do it, so I'm going to do it. It's a theory that the president is the only one who can act in an emergency, and therefore they have to have the ability to do whatever is necessary. So, and then lastly, the thing I'm going to talk with you about in the second video, delegated powers, where Congress passes a law that by its terms gives additional powers to the president, creating an agency in the executive branch that can do all sorts of things. Make all kinds of decisions. And so that power then lands in the executive branch when it was originally the congressional power to make laws. So we're going to talk about that at length in the second video. But now we'll talk about enumerated, implied, and inherent powers for the rest of this video. Let's some examples of the enumerated powers. The power to appoint thousands of officials, members of the judicial branch, heads of all these agencies and the cabinet and so forth. The power to convene Congress and to address them in the State of the Union as well. The power to make treaties. It's right there in the text of the Constitution. The power to veto legislation. The commander-in-chief power, the head of our military. The power to pardon. These are, they're all there right there in Article 2 as the powers of the president. It's right there in writing. There's no question that they have those powers. Like in the case of appointing, they appoint ambassadors, they appoint judges, the whole federal judiciary, cabinet and other high-ranking officials, something on the order of 4,000 jobs that the president can just appoint, and there's no question about it. The power to make treaties. The president shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators concur. So, president makes treaties, they have to be ratified by a 2/3 vote of the Senate. Now, there are other things they do. They also try to make what are called fast-track agreements, where the president will negotiate an agreement that limits the power of Congress to rewrite or negotiate it. Mayors do this as well. With contracts. They call them fast-track agreements. It's where the agreement by its terms that the president negotiates says that none of the terms can be renegotiated. And so it goes to the Senate for ratification with the understanding that if you change a word of this, it'll never be an agreement. So it's all or nothing. So that ties Congress, the Senate's hands so they can't insist on changes. If they do it, the agreement will never be made. Raises the stakes. So what presidents sometimes do instead is they'll make an executive agreement under their implied powers, foreign policy powers, which might have the same effect. But understand an executive agreement, if the president doesn't get it ratified as a treaty, then a subsequent president can rescind the executive agreement, which has happened many times. And then the power to receive ambassadors, that is the power to recognize the governments of foreign nations as legitimate. That's the president's power. It's a very important one. Commander-in-Chief of the military. Well, there's something called the War Powers Resolution. 1973 arose out of the tremendous controversy over the Vietnam War, where we never had a declaration of war. We were at war for a long time in Vietnam, and it was never a declaration of war. Well, now, presidents must seek prior congressional approval to use force where they are introducing U.S. armed forces into hostilities. And the power exists. Congress recognizes that presidents have this power to command the military even when we're not at war. See, this is before there's a declaration of war. Presidents still are commander of the military, and so Congress acknowledges that presidents can send them into harm's way, but they require that the president consult with them, report to them within 60 days, and Congress then has to approve keeping the troops there after 60 days. Now, there are some constitutional issues. Some presidents have said they don't think this is constitutional, but they've all abided by it since it was passed. So that is the law presently. Presidents can also grant pardons and reprieves. Now, this is a check on the judicial branch. This is, they can say, well, you were convicted in a court, but I'm going to pardon you, or I'm going to commute your sentence so you don't have to serve any more time. And they can pardon someone before they're convicted, after they're convicted, and whenever they want to. The only real limit on the pardoning power, well, two limits. One is it's only for federal crimes. Presidents can't pardon people for state crimes. Governors can, but presidents can't. So that any federal crime, the president can pardon them for. It's basically unlimited, except they can't pardon someone who was impeached. And impeachment is outside the president's pardon power entirely. Most famous pardon was President Ford pardoning Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon resigned the presidency. He would certainly have been prosecuted for his crimes, except that President Gerald Ford pardoned him, which was very controversial. Many people thought Ford shouldn't have done it. Other people thought it was a necessary step to end the turmoil over Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Okay, now those are the enumerated powers. Now we come to the implied powers. These are the ones that are not in the text of the Constitution, but courts have agreed that presidents must have these powers. It's implied that they can do these things because of the other things that we know they have to do. One is executive privilege. Not in the Constitution, but courts have agreed that presidents have to be able to shield certain communications with their aides from Congress and from the public. And courts. So you can't get at these privileged communications. When presidents are communicating confidentially with their aides about public policy matters, particularly about matters of national security, they are privileged, meaning even if there's a subpoena from Congress or a judge, the president can say, no, you can't see it, it's privileged. That's an implied power. I mentioned negotiating executive agreements with other countries. That's an implied power. But it's assumed that sometimes they need to do this, and so they can. Setting a legislative agenda for Congress, the president's initiatives, which they often state in the State of the Union address. Well, that's not in the Constitution. That's Congress's job. But it has been implied since presidents veto legislation that they have a role to play here, and so they often do that. They also speak as the voice of the United States to the world. And they, as I mentioned earlier, they send U.S. troops into action in emergencies without a declaration of war. That's an implied power. If they couldn't do it, who could? And if no one could, then what would we do? Would we have to wait for a declaration of war with every single time our soldiers were required to fire a shot? So that's the argument that's used to justify president's emergency power to use our troops. And now we come to the most controversial one. Inherent power. Now, that is not stated anywhere in the Constitution, and it isn't really an implied power. You could call it an implied power. I mean, it is, but it's not a specific implied power. In other words, it's not like a specific thing like executive privilege. Inherent power is a broad concept that the president, by implication, must have the power. This is a thing that presidents believe. It is controversial. Not everyone believes in this. The presidents need to be able to do whatever is necessary to protect the country. Not just troops, not just privilege. No, anything that is that they believe is necessary to protect the country, they should have the power to do. Particularly in times of crisis, that it is inherent, meaning contained, within the role of the president as the chief executive and the commander-in-chief. Basically, it's like this. Look, we're a country in a world that is a dangerous place. If something has to be done, and if Congress can't or doesn't act in time, then somebody has to act, and that somebody must be the president. And so the president has the power to do whatever they think is necessary. But you can see this is controversial, and the limits of this are very unclear. Sometimes these things happen when Congress has told the president they don't want something done. Other times Congress has said nothing. Other times they might have encouraged the presidents to act. These are complicated situations. It is not clear. Not everyone agrees with the existence of inherent power, but presidents do. Here's a statement of it by President Teddy Roosevelt. He said, "My view was that every executive officer was a steward of the people, bound actively and affirmatively to do all he could for the people, and not to content himself with the negative merit of keeping his talents undamaged in a napkin. He said he believed that it was not only his right but his duty to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded, unless such action was forbidden by the Constitution or by the laws. So basically his theory is he could do whatever he felt was necessary unless it was specifically prohibited. That's a controversial view, but that's a statement of inherent power. So there are two legal theories often used. One is called the sole organ theory. That's the theory that in foreign policy, the president is, quote, the sole organ, meaning the only spokesperson for the nation in anything related to foreign affairs. So therefore, he can do anything any nation is allowed to do under international law, regardless of what the Constitution says. If a country can do it, then the president has to be able to do it. That's the logic. If other countries can do it, then we can do it, and that means the president can do it. And then the other theory that is popular with Republicans is something called the unitary executive theory, which is the Constitution gives the president all the executive power, and Congress cannot limit the executive power. Now, other scholars say, well, that's dangerous. Congress has to be able to check or stop presidents from doing things that they think are wrong. And this is almost a theory of executive supremacy versus legislative supremacy. So it's an extreme statement of presidential power. Not everyone agrees with it. Here's some examples of inherent power. Presidents claiming they had it. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus. That is the ability of imprisoned people to get directly to the federal courts. He suspended that. And the Supreme Court, he did it on his own authority. And the Supreme Court told him, it happened after he was assassinated, but the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that he did not have the power to do that. That only Congress can suspend the writ of habeas corpus by legislation. He also withdrew money from the Treasury to fight the war. He activated state militias. He ordered a blockade of the southern states. And he did all these things under his claim of inherent power. The Civil War had started. He said, I have to be able to do whatever is necessary to fight the war. That's an example of it. Harry Truman initially sent troops to Korea without a declaration of war. He was acting pursuant to a United Nations resolution. He also ordered the seizure of steel mills during the Korean War, and the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional in the case of Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer. George W. Bush created military commissions to try suspected terrorists. He designated people, including U.S. citizens, as enemy combatants and claimed the authority to detain them as long as he wanted without ever charging them with a crime. And he eavesdropped on Americans without a warrant. The Supreme Court slapped him down on many of these things, said he couldn't do them, and he changed his procedures and stopped doing the things that he was told he could not do. President Obama ordered targeted assassinations or killings of suspected terrorists in other countries using drones. These are the aircraft that just fly. They're robotically controlled, remotely controlled. He had U.S. citizens killed. 2 U.S. citizens, Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son, were both killed. They were U.S. citizens. He raised the minimum wage for federal contractors. He took actions on immigration, DACA, that's just the Dreamers, Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. Now, that particular executive order was rescinded by Donald Trump. But point is, these are all actions that presidents took when they really were acting in the scope of mainly inherent power. Donald Trump made extreme claims of inherent presidential power. He claimed that he had the right as president to refuse to comply with congressional subpoenas at all. He claimed he was completely immune from all criminal prosecution. And he even claimed in court after his administration ended that he was still immune and still didn't have to supply because he had been president in the past. He claimed the right to block release of presidential documents that Congress wanted after his presidency had ended. And so, the courts say, well, no, you only have these powers when you are the president. So I say this is an extreme claim of inherent power because he's claiming it continues even after you're no longer president. And then there was another point during the COVID pandemic When there was a time during the COVID pandemic when the states had essentially closed down their economies. These things were done pursuant to state law, for the most part. And the questions were asked of Trump, like, well, when we reopen, what authority do you have to declare that the economy will restart again and things will reopen? And he said, I have the ultimate authority. And then he said, when someone is the president of the United States, the authority is total. And that's the way it's got to be. It's total. The governors know that. And he said that governors can't do anything without the approval of the President of the United States. Well, you see, he was saying that governors could not make their decisions about reopening their states and closing their states without his approval. Now, that is an extreme example of a claim of inherent authority. And the states did, in fact, make their own decisions, and governors went ahead and did what they wanted anyway. But that was, I guess, a point being, presidents are prone to saying things like this. Trump's claims were more extreme than most, but as you've seen, Teddy Roosevelt and a number of other presidents used inherent powers as well. So now what we're going to do here, I'm going to end here, and the next presentation on the president, the second video, will go more into the politics of the presidency as a person. We'll also talk about this whole notion of delegated powers. That's the fourth of these four types of powers. So when we go to the second video, we'll cover delegated powers and then discuss the presidents and the whole question of presidential personality and its role in the presidency.